My name is Pat Source, and I'm the Administrative Chair of the School of Print Media and a member of the Planning Committee for this wonderful symposium. I hope you all enjoyed the wonderful evening last night and the interactive sessions yesterday. I think you were able to experience the wide range of interests and expertise of our faculty and staff and students here. And I thank all of the presenters yesterday for creating such an exciting environment for our conference attendees. Before we begin with the formal presentations, I'd like to make a few announcements. I'd like to thank our captioning crew, Wendy Wheeler and Wendy Eldridge, for their help today. And another reminder about posting comments on our social media site. It's at the bottom of the screen. I was reminded about how powerful this tool is when yesterday we had someone send us a note about how cool it was in this auditorium. And we were able to get facilities management on the job, and we were able to send out a note back to folks saying, we're on it, we've managed to bring the temperature down, or up, I guess up it was. Our theme today is media and technology. We've got to continue our California connection with Richard here today. And so we'll see presentations by Richard Lanham, Professor Emeritus from UCLA, John Orwant, Engineering Manager at Google, and after their talks, Pat Albanese, Gannett Distinguished Professor from the School of Print Media, will be the moderator for the question and answer session. Our first presenter is Richard Lanham. Richard will actually be spanning the topic from yesterday on reading and writing and today's topic on technology. He will be relating his experience in teaching undergraduates on how to read conventional text better, and therefore how they got to learn how to write better. This was part of his work in analyzing prose. In addition, he'll touch on his latest book, The Economics of Attention. Now a little bit more about Richard. Richard was educated at Yale University, from which he holds an AB, MA, and PhD degrees in English. He began teaching at Dartmouth College, and from 1965 to 1994 taught in the English department at UCLA, where he is now Professor Emeritus. He has been an NEH Senior Fellow, a Guggenheim Foundation Fellow, a 1994 International Scholar at our own George Eastman House here in Rochester, and the 95 Andrew Mellon Professor at Tulane University. Richard is the author of numerous books of literary criticism and prose stylistics. His newest book, The Economics of Attention, was published by the University of Chicago Press in 2006. Please welcome Richard Lanham.
Can you hear me okay? Very good. I'm not going to have any dazzling computer effects, and I'm even talking from written notes. I'm a clerk of a forgotten mood, I think. I want to thank the organizers of this wonderful conference for inviting me. I've never had the pleasure of talking to an audience that includes people who are specialists in books, which I've spent my life reading, writing, and buying, and in matters digital, where I've been wandering and stubbing my toe, as you'll hear, since about 1980, and in the combination of teaching and theorizing, which I guess is what RIT is all about. I'm very grateful to be asked to come. I say these things not simply as statutory formalities, but because I want to make use of you. I want to tell you about a video which I made 30 years ago. That reminds me probably not only that I'm the oldest person in the room, but that 30 years ago, many of you weren't even born. So I'm asking you to take a journey back into the yesteryear of multimedia. Incunabula is the word usually given for books, I think, in the first 50 years after Gutenberg. My Revising Prose video is 30 years old, so I think it qualifies as an incunabulum of multimedia. And I thought it might be fun for all of us in the midst of this heavy theorizing about the future to talk for a little while about something that is 30 years old. At least we know we don't have to guess about what happened to it. I'm going to tell you what happened to it and ask you what you make of it. It was an interesting venture. Let me give you a little bit of background about it, and then I'll show you the video, and then I'm going to reflect upon it a little bit with the wisdom of age and hindsight, and then ask you what you make of it, which is really why I accepted this assignment. I'm not used to lecturing with bright lights in my eye, and nor in this medical auditorium. I feel as if I ought to be lying out on a table while somebody slices me from my guggle to my zatch for your edification. So if I do this, it's not that I'm the Lone Ranger trying to find Tonto, but that I'm trying to block the light out for a while. Let me give you a little background on the video. In 1979, I was given a good deal of money by the Vice Chancellor at UCLA to start a campus-wide writing program. This wasn't a high-toned creative writing program, but the kind of composition program which has always been lived in the low-rent district in English departments and in the academic world. I had the Vice Chancellor, Bill Schaefer, and I had been talking over the previous years about what was going to happen to UCLA. It was very clear that, as we now have come to call it, a diverse student body was going to come there. The enrollment patterns for UCLA have been very consistent over a long period of time. You know that 75% of the undergraduates are going to come from the Los Angeles Unified School District. You know pretty much where most of the rest of them are going to come. It was clear that they were going to be a linguistic and ethnic, much more diverse group than they had ever been before. And one of two things was certain to happen. Either they were going to come to UCLA in numbers representative of their place in the population, in which case there were going to be real problems with second language and second dialect interference and with student writing generally, or they were not going to come and there were going to be even bigger problems with political and social issues. They came, and I was given a good deal of money to start a campus-wide program. In 1979, I hired 5 of my graduate students. It was an entirely open competition for people to help me. They were all my students. They were all older women who were tied to Los Angeles, and I just hired them. We ran an ad in the last number of the Modern Language Association job list. I'm sure some of you are aware of that. The Modern Language Association is the trade group for English and foreign language teachers. We ran an ad. We had 375 applications with writing samples. Try that on. We read through them, and on Memorial Day in 1980, I got on an airplane, and I flew to San Francisco, New York, Boston, Washington, and Chicago, and interviewed 50 people, and from them, we hired 31 full-time lecturers, and they came to UCLA, and the whole program started up that year. It was a great dream of mine. I'd always wanted to do a startup company, and that's what this was. It was a campus-wide program. We invented curricula for the business school, for the law school already had a program, the inadequacy of which we failed to convince them. We started a whole range of courses. The most successful one, I think, was writing for business and government. One of the graduates of that went on to become the director of education for IBM. He said, if you're ever in New York, I'll buy you lunch. And so I was, and he did. And I said, well, what do you do for IBM? And he said, I direct the education for the 319,000 people who work for IBM. And I thought, well, that was a pretty good alumnus to have. A couple of the other graduates went on to work for McKinsey. It was a sketch, really. They were good 60s, Berkeley's liberals. When they went to work for McKinsey, one of them came to my house in Brentwood, and she had on high heels and a wonderful business suit, and she looked like $1 million. And I said, Donna, what's become of you? And she said, oh, well, you know, nothing like earning $85,000 a year. It was a great group. These 31 people who showed up, they said, Professor Lanham, we don't understand it. You know, we all get along. We're all the same kind of people interested in the same kind of things. And I said, yeah, that's really an accident, isn't it? I wonder how that happened. They were a terrific group of people. Even my colleagues in the English department admitted this, although they were not keen to do so. So it was a very expansive time and a very exciting time. Part of it for me was I wanted somehow to add what maybe we didn't even call it a media ingredient then. I wanted some kind of leverage, some kind of way to create some programs that might work out of the courses we were given and last and be able to be amplified to other places. I didn't otherwise know what I was doing, but I wanted to do that. And what I wanted was, I'd had written 2 or 3 years ago. Am I talking loud enough for you? Good. As I got older, my voice seemed to fall down, and many people, including my wife, have reproached me for this. And this was unusual for me because my mother used to say, Rich, honey, you have a loud voice, but not always a pleasing one. And so I never thought this was going to be a problem of mine. So I wanted to do some kind of television program, and I picked a book called Revising Prose that I had written 2 or 3 years, 6 years before. And I said, I want somehow to do something that lets words move around on the page and make funny noises and be in different colors. And what I was trying to feel my way toward was illustrating the structural power circuits, the inner tensions of how the English sentence in a particular kind of case worked. That's all I knew. I went to Andrea Rich, who was the AV person at UCLA then, went on to Wealth and Honor as the vice chancellor and then the director of the LA County Museum. And I said, Andrea, I just want some kind of program that'll make words move around on the page and make funny noises and light up, because I want to see. There's a book about prose revision, and it's all about action, and the action is all frozen on the page. I wanted to get it going. She didn't know what I was talking about. Nobody knew what I was talking about because nothing like that had ever been done. But she said, well, I tell you what. I've got a machine called a Chiron machine. Its title is movies. So have any of you old enough to know what a Chiron machine? Ah, good. Hardly one person. We'll remember, won't we? So Andrea said, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll give you the use of that machine this summer. We were in June then. And I'll give you Jim Stodell, who was one of their computer people, though he had never programmed a Chiron machine to do this or anything else, to see what you can do. And why don't you go home and give me a script in 2 weeks, and I'll guarantee you a 30-minute program by the end of the summer. Well, you know what she was thinking. Nobody in the academic world has ever done anything in 2 weeks. So what was I going to do? And furthermore, I hadn't the faintest idea what I was doing. Chris Anderson was talking about the perplexities of being the editor of Wired and starting to do something new. And I said to myself, buddy, you didn't know anything about this. I didn't know anything at all about this idea. I just wanted words to move around and go bleep, bleep, and maybe amuse people a little bit, because the prose revision is really time in the penalty box. And composition teachers really all belong. I spent a lot of my time teaching composition. It was a very non-strategic thing to do at UCLA. When I went there in 1965, teaching wasn't held against you, but it wasn't at the forefront of their regard. It was a research place, as it still is, but I kept on teaching comp and volunteering to teach remedial comp, largely because I started out in graduate school studying the early Tudor humanists, and they were really talking about the English sentence. They were talking about the Latin sense, more specifically. They were talking about the teaching of writing and reading as fundamental to the enterprise, and so I thought I was keeping faith with them. Anyway, so I went home and got a yellow pad and drew a line down the middle and wrote video on one side and audio on the other, and I thought, well, that's a start. And so I wrote this script, and I took it to Joe Stodell and said, look, there's no point in my pretending that I know what I'm talking about. Let's see if we can work together and get something by the end of the summer. So we did, and mostly it was what I wrote, and I narrated it, and we had it to go at the end of the autumn. I'll have to, as the lawyers say, ask you to stipulate to what I'm going to say next. The video was a success. It was used on, the University of California had the intellectual property rights because they paid to make it. So it was used on every campus of the university. It was shown at one time when it first came out 4 times a day at UCLA. It was shown on every state university campus. Since then, I've sold copies at, I don't know, 200 or 300 institutions. It's been a big success. It's still in print, or whatever videos are still in. My little company, Rhetorica, sells it, and we've sold about 1 a week. That sounds lame and inadequate compared to the 80,000 editions of Wired, but for a school teacher who wanted to reach teachers, it's not bad because they keep being shown over and over. The superintendent of state education in South Carolina met me at a party and said, I want you to know I've shown that film 600 times. And I thought, oh my God, he's heard me narrate this 600 times and he can still stand to be in the same room with me? That's statesmanship. So it's been a big success. The most interesting thing for me has been that it's a success at every level. It was shown at the informal and, of course, non-existent remedial class that kept the basketball team on the court at UCLA. It was, I sold a site license to the International Monetary Fund to put it on their server. I've shown it to a lot of law firms. Last time I did that was in Washington, and lawyers came out and said, oh, Professor Lanham, I really like that movie. I really dig those retro graphics. And, it's like what happens to you at a certain age when people say, you're looking very good for somebody your age. So you will see this movie. I've given you, I'm going to show a 17-minute excerpt of the movie. I want to make use of you in this way because as soon as I got this assignment, I said, well, I'll try to talk about the economics of attention a little bit, but I'll do it sideways. I asked the organizers of the conference to tell the members of all my colleagues here that I would put the third chapter of I had a special electronic third chapter of the economics of attention because I wanted to make things move, and you couldn't do it in a book. And so we kludged, as we used to say, we kludged up an electronic third chapter, which you can still see, and I hope some of you have seen. I'll show a couple of cuts from it later if I don't talk too much and too long. So what I want you all, need your wisdom about is what makes this program, it still works. What makes it work, and why especially does it work at every level? I'm genuinely puzzled about it. I don't know enough either about the neurology of the brain, about all the things you all know about how words move around and how type moves around. After I came here and saw the sophistication of the typographical presence here, I thought, oh God, Rich, you should have talked about something else. But there it is. You'll have to judge. Remember what 1980 was like? I didn't even buy my first computer till 1981. It was an Osborne. I bet nobody in this room. You had, oh, I know. Well, you see, I'm not an antique yet. You remember that? Yes. Weighed 25 pounds and it had a 5-inch screen. It was, anyway, there wasn't much going on in 1980. And I went to my first SIGGRAPH meeting in, I think, 1981 or 2. You guys, I'm sure you all belong to SIGGRAPH, when the first meeting was. Yeah. That was what really set me on the track to electronic text. I saw an Evans and Sutherland program about, a stick frame program about simulating carrier landings of an aircraft on a canted carrier. And you know how that is. The carrier's going this way, but the deck's this way, and they tried to put. And I looked at it, and I said, wait a minute, this is going to happen to words. You better get on this bandwagon, because a change like this hasn't happened since Gutenberg, or really, as I found out, since the scribes started leaving space between words in about the year 1000. Paul Singer's written a great book about that called Space Between Words you might want to look at. Anyway, so I'll show you this film, or I don't know what to call it. I never knew what to call it, and I still don't know what to call it. I guess with the wisdom of hindsight, you might think about it as a kind of prototypical electronic book. It's a kind of interesting modeling situation, because the book is very close to it. The book is still selling in its 5th edition. If you wanted to compare the two modes of presentation, it's almost a laboratory experiment. So I'll show it to you, and then I'm going to say a few things, contribute a few pseudo-profundities about what it has meant to me since then, and then I'm going to ask you all to help me out. And it's a genuine request, because I'm at a point in my life when I can do finally something else. I want to do something like this about the English sentence and the internal structure of the English sentence, and I want to do it in a way that might be useful not only in America but around the world. But to do that, I'll need a lot of help. So that's why I'm here. Would you play the video now?
In revising prose, you've read about what has come to be the dominant prose style in contemporary America, a style we've called the official style. You've also had some practice in a quick emergency revision procedure, the paramedic method, or PM. In this lesson, we're going to use TV graphics to show you how the PM works. First, though, let's review both the official style and the PM. Then, we'll put them into collision. The official style has been around a long time. It is the native language of bureaucracy and always has been. No self-respecting civil servant in ancient Rome, for example, would ask for a bribe. Of course not. But a little guest present, a sportula or little basket, would certainly oil the bureaucratic machinery. A provincial Greek bureaucrat living in the Egyptian town of Oxyrhynchus several centuries before Christ would write not, "I live in Oxyrhynchus," but, "I am a resident of that most splendid of splendid towns, Oxyrhynchus." and the grain tax he extorted from the peasants was called the Happy Shipment, much as our own Atomic Energy Commission at one time rechristened the standard measurement of deadly atomic radiation a sunshine unit. Such oily, nervy euphemism characterizes the official style from the beginning until yesterday's newspaper, which reports multimodal interface as a new name for a bus station with a bicycle rack. And for the official stylist, impersonality comes as naturally as fancy names for plain objects. Never say, "I think he's an idiot," or "I fired him," but rather, appropriate action was initiated on the basis of systematic discussion, indicating that the termination process would be appropriate. First, put everything in the passive voice, not "I decided," but "it was decided by me," and then get the me out and let the action float in an impersonal construction. It was decided that. Above all, the official style is a noun style, emphasizing stasis, inaction, rather than action. The official writer makes all his natural verbs into nouns, and then uses a form of to be, the weakest, most lifeless, colorless verb, so as to give the sentence grammatical completeness. Thus, this sentence needs an active verb, becomes this sentence is in need of an active verb. He plays energetically becomes there is a great deal of energy in his play. When you hide the action in a noun like this, you lose track of who is doing what to whom, or who is kicking who. Instead of Jim kicks Bill, you get there is a kicking interaction between Jim and Bill. Displacing the action from verb to noun like this brings several inevitable consequences. First, the action is blurred. In the first sentence, the action is concentrated in a single word, and we get to that word quickly. In the second, the energy in play is smeared across the whole sentence. From there is to play runs a long, rolling letdown. Second, the sentence takes the form of is plus a string of prepositional phrases. And third, the sentence takes a long time to get going. You're tired out before you get to a word that really matters. And so we have an official style that is euphemistic, a noun style rather than a verb style, a style that hides its action in passive and impersonal constructions, that takes a long time to get going, and that is built up from is plus strings of prepositional phrases. This is the style that was waiting when modern science, and especially 20th century social science, came along looking for a special language. Scientists wanted a language that, one, welcomed a special terminology, and there was the bureaucratic habit of euphemism ready at hand. Two, they wanted a language that was built on concepts, and there was the noun style ready to hand. Three, they wanted a language that above all sounded scientific, impersonal, detached, implying all the chilly yet ineluctable truths of physics. And again, there was the official style's wonderfully welcoming impersonality, a style in which things happen, but people never get in the way. Finally, the scientist wanted a style which simply gave the facts. And again, the official style's favorite verb habit, is plus prepositional phrases, was right there all along, simply telling us that something exists. And it was easy to add more data, just stick on an extra prepositional phrase. Thus, the full modern official style came, saw, and conquered, or rather, deemed the conquering mode to be appropriate. It has, God help us, become the predominant style of our time. Now, how do you revise it into English? First, circle the prepositions. Next, circle the is forms. Then ask yourself, who's kicking who? Where is the real action in the sentence? Who's doing what to whom? When you found the kicking action, put it in a simple active verb. And finally, get the sentence going fast. No long wind-ups. Here are some examples from a recent sociobiology text. There is a good deal of circumstantial evidence in support of this scheme. First, the prepositions. Notice how the rhythm of the sentence immediately gets monotonous? I'll exaggerate the effect a little with my voice to underline it for you. There is a good deal of circumstantial evidence in support of this scheme. It sounds like a list. See what I mean? The sentence comes to look and sound like a laundry list. Now for step 2 of the paramedic method. Find the is. Notice what a lame beginning the there is formula provides for a sentence. The perfect opening formula for a laundry list. Guaranteed monotony. There is a good deal of circumstantial evidence in support of this scheme. Da-da-dum, da-da-dum, and so on to slumberland. Once you choose the there is plus prepositional phrases formula, you are locked into this guaranteed monotony. How do you get out? Well, ask, rule 3 of the paramedic method, who's kicking who? Obviously, the kicker is circumstantial evidence. Let's begin there. What is this evidence doing? Where is the action? Buried way down there in support, of course. We'll disinter it. All right, we've now followed rule 4 of the paramedic method. And who's the kickee, the direct object on the receiving end? This scheme. Now, how about the long wind-up opening? There is a good deal of. No need for there is any longer, since we have a real live verb in supports. A good deal of is a long-winded way to say much. Now, the completed revision reads, much circumstantial evidence supports this scheme. We have now complied with Rule 5 of the paramedic method. Start fast. The official style loves the mindless introduction. Here are some more slow wind-ups from the author of our specimen sentence. The mindless introduction does not really say anything. It amounts to a high-class version of, a fill-in grunt while you figure out what to say. Meanwhile, your sentence, that virgin rocket, has fired, lifted tentatively a few inches off the ground, fizzled, and fallen back dead on the launching pad. The official style loves verbal formulas, and we can see a good example of it here. The blah blah is that opening. We've gotten rid of the fizzled rocket opening of our specimen sentence, and so the final before and after scene looks like this. Well, well, 6 words instead of 13, a large factor of 54%. The official style, whether written by a student or a licensed bureaucrat, generally runs to a large factor of 50%, plus or minus 5. In your revision, you can use this as a goal, if not an infallible rule. If you haven't cut the sentence in half, bash on. But not only the scientists have embraced the official style, humanists have come to love it too, especially its spasmodic prepositional phrase strings. You see unrolling before you a sentence written by a famous medieval historian. Look at the prepositional phrases. Ugh, they seem to cry out for scrolling down in the laundry list formula. The problem here clearly is sentence shape. This is not a sentence. As we've charted it, it reminds you of a hot dog machine stuck open. Only instead of hot dogs, it keeps turning out prepositional phrases. What do you do with a hiccuping monster like this? Again, I'll try to underscore with my voice the monotony this kind of prose creates. On the other side of the coin, we see signs of the loosening of ancient ties, of corporate unity, in the cathedral chapter itself, in the falling off, in the attendance of the great officers of the cathedral, of Chartres, as in the witness lists of charters in the 1140s. As you read a sentence like this, looking at its shape, it begins to fall apart. It is as if the energy of the sentence ran down a little with each prepositional phrase, like a row of dominoes that starts to fall over. Is there any way to break out of this laundry list formula? Well, let's try. And we'll move a little faster now, since you know the moves. The first two prepositional phrases are easy. The kicker is the ancient ties of corporate unity. Anything we can do about this of? Why not the ancient corporate ties? Bleep of and unity and move corporate over. The kicking action lies in loosening. So we have this. But now we face a problem, the inevitable one for a line of dominoes prepositional phrase string. Look at the whole passage again. What about the next phrase, in the cathedral chapter itself? Does it refer back to ancient ties? If so, the two main parts of the sentence look like this. Or does in the cathedral chapter itself form part of the evidence, like the falling off in attendance? In other words, does the sentence look like this? In these endless, mindless prepositional phrase agglomerations, you lose track of what phrase goes with what. Here, I'd guess, and it's anybody's guess, that the first alternative was intended. We'll continue the revision under that assumption. The rest goes easily into a second sentence. So, the final revision. But wait a minute. How about begin to loosen? Loosen is an inceptive verb to begin with. That is, it is one whose action is beginning. Loosen equals begin to be loose. So we don't need begin to. Now, again, the final revision. And no list form needed, finally, once we've squeezed all the water out. Under the heap of dominoes lurked only one assertion and one piece of evidence for it. And how did it all turn out? Not bad. The lard factor, 50%, is right on the money, and we've excised 12 of the 14 prepositional phrases. Sometimes, though, it is not only the shape that distinguishes the official style, but the diction. Consider this example. Shapeless for sure, but look at what happens to shape when you revise for word choice. In the face of both the severity and continuing character of the budgetary stringencies which we thus face, equals, since we will remain very short of money, we have concluded that we must undertake an immediate and thorough programmatic review and reordering of academic priorities, equals, we must reorder academic priorities. And a review that would have been required in any event, although perhaps on a less intensive time scale, equals, we would have had to do this anyway, though not so quickly. Again, the original and the revision. Here, we didn't worry about the shape at all. We just translated the pretentious guff into plain English, and the shape took care of itself. Stylistic elements all interconnect. If one rule in the parametric method doesn't reveal the problem, another one will. Now for the first sentence in detail.
I'd skipped over
This
those.
student is not making a mistake. He or she is imitating the official style. Look at the prepositional phrases. And notice how the infinitive sign, the to, into comment, joins the fun. We'll do a quick revision. We don't need William's poem because it is given by the assignment. So we have this. I'll make the rest of the changes without comment. Ask yourself why they've been made. Sounds funny, huh? The "and his influence" seems tacked on. How about this? Original again. A large factor of 71%, typical of the verbal diarrhea the official style precipitates in the beginning writer. Let's do one more here. First, the mindless, fizzled rocket opening. Then, quick surgical rearrangement. When you've gotten here, you've peeled the onion until there is nothing left. This often happens. Revision reveals at last, as here, a banal truism. After you've gotten here by steps of careful revision, and not before, you're entitled to take the last step. Back to the drafting board for some real ideas.
Okay. Thank you. You know, when I was listening yesterday to the interesting interchange between Chris Anderson and Joanna Drucker about the two worlds that they came from, the world of commerce and practical application and the world of academic experiment, it occurred to me that maybe my effort here was trying to do both. That is, I was trying to figure out how to do something that hadn't been done before, and it certainly was an academic experiment. That is, I couldn't have gotten a publisher interested in this. I've never gotten any of the publishers of the book ever interested in this for any reason in the subsequent 30 years. But I won't say anything more about that. I would have to write it on asbestos. But at the same time, I wanted to make some kind of impact. I wanted it to really work, and it did. And it occurred to me as I was on the plane coming here that that's really the particular posture of RIT, as I understand it, that you have a faculty capable of great theoretical complexity, but you're also interested in educating students to go out in the world and to get jobs and to exert a force in the world, and so that this kind of thing mightn't be so unwelcome to you anyway. That's one of the things I thought. Let me make a few comments, and then I'm going to ask for your help in how I ought to do another one now that I have the time to do it. The first thing is about the official style. The larger subject is guild language, and guild language is stronger even now even than it was then. And students are asked to read a great many kinds of guild language, all of which are variations on the official style. Shakespeare says, "No profit is where is no pleasure taken," and students don't take any pleasure in this kind of reading. I once asked a student who was reading this kind of stuff and writing this kind of stuff, and in my office after the Kleenex phase, I said, "Well, what do you think when you read this stuff?" And she said, "Well, I don't really read it. I just skip around from phrase to phrase because I know it's a lot of bullshit anyway. Excuse me, it's a lot of guff. Anyway, and so I went down to the student store to where they sell used textbooks and noticed what was highlighted. And what was highlighted was this same skipping rhythm. And I thought maybe this is too strong, but I thought for a large percentage of our students, we're teaching them with this kind of language how to hate reading. Reading of this sort is just time in the penalty box. And that's not exactly what we want to do. It was clear that this kind of video, which was about writing, was really about reading as well, and that the two were the same. The organizers of this conference, by the way they set it up, recognized this. You can't really decide if your interest is in human respiration that you are going to specialize in breathing out and let some other department do breathing in. And that you might never meet at the same conferences, but that's all right. You were part of a common endeavor, though you didn't know what it was. The two are clear. If you then add voice into this, and I really wanted to do that, and to add voice to the book too, but it was frustrating. I couldn't do it. You come back to the classic unity of, I spent my life studying formal rhetoric, and from the Greeks onward, it was about a center of education that had to do with the word, but the word spoken, written, spoken and written at the same time, and read. Speaking, reading, and writing were part of the same act of intellectual respiration, and I was somehow trying to grope my way toward that in this text. I was also reflecting on in this conference and elsewhere on revision. This was the first, and I must be wrong. There will be people who specialize in writing here who will correct me, but I don't know of any other book about prose revision. It's very odd because the first kind of advice you get from any textbook is writing is always revision. But I don't know of any book that says we're frankly about revision. And yet I would bet that the students who graduate from RIT go out into environments in which revision is the fundamental kind of writing that they do. I bet if you're working for a large corporation, your boss doesn't say, now go away and dream up a memo for such and such. He says, here's what I want you to do, do it or revise it. Revision is in terms of the world of affairs, is much the more fundamental act of writing. But it's also true in the internet, where we're told there are no conclusions, but one thing just leads to another. It's the central theme of a great deal of art, especially postmodern art. I have a wonderful quotation, I forgot to bring it with me, from the Swiss sculptor Jean Tinguely. He's the one who builds great big machines and heaps of things and then burns them down. Great, really wonderful, kind of funny sculptor. And he started out, this is in Pontus Houghton's book on Tinguely. He said, I didn't want all these works that finished. I wanted to be able to keep returning to them. I wanted to give them a sense of timelessness, part of the whole postmodern change from the masterpiece psychology top down to the audience psychology bottom up, which emerged, I think, in what, if I understood her correctly, what Joanna Drucker was trying to talk about. So revision turns out to be really a kind of polymorphous act that occurs all kinds of ways. And I didn't know that when I was doing this, but it's kind of interesting that it's worked out that way. Another thing happened that I thought was kind of surprising. This was aiming at trying to teach students how to revise a particular kind of style. First thing I noticed, I always, as part of a lifelong habit of academic masochism, I read all my student papers and exams myself, and I really got to know how they were writing, and they weren't making, that's not right, they were making plenty of standard grammatical mistakes, but what they were really doing was an act of stylistic imitation. They were imitating the official style. They were being taught how to read and write this particular style. It was a hideously constricting style if what I was trying to teach them was the glories of a Shakespeare play or Chaucer's Troilus and Cressida or something like that. And so what happened was that this, what shall I call it, movie, program? If you could give me a name for it, I haven't 30 years later figured one out, I'd be very grateful. It really did what I wanted finally to do, which was to make them stylistically aware. I wanted to make them aware that reading is forever an act first of creating and then of changing. I think even the act of the place of the brain, if any of you have read Stanislaus Dehaene's interesting new book, Reading in the Brain, as I'm sure many of you have, reading occurs in one place, but I would bet the analysis part includes it in another. Anyway, that there is this rocking motion in the economics of attention. I talk about it as a toggle switch between two kinds of attention, looking through a text or looking at a text. This is a theory of management. If you carry it far enough, which I don't have time to do here, between thinking about the economy as a stuff economy based on extracting elements from the earth on the one hand and thinking about it as orchestrating attention on the other, and how you move from those two. So in the book, anyway, I told people I'd talk a little about the book. It's the only thing I'm going to say. That what happens at the sentence level here is exactly what happens if you're really trying to train a manager in the current economy. You're moving from these two different ways of looking at experience, one to another, and trying to figure out what the proper balance point is. So those things seem to me of some interest. I undermined what I was trying to spend my professional life doing in an odd way, and it didn't occur to me until a little later, and then I got embarrassed by it, so I kept mum. The center of Renaissance humanism, certainly early Tudor humanism, the scholars who were really interested in founding schools and reviving classical rhetoric, the people I really admired the most, they were always interested in defining, in editing classical text. The great, and even still now among tough classicists, the real act is editing a classical text definitively. This was the way you established cultural authority, and humanistic scholarship have been living ever since on that idea that if you took, in this case, in the Renaissance case, the Latin and Greek text and created definitive text, that would be the basis upon which humanistic inquiry would proceed. It was the intellectual fundament of the intellectual basis of inquiry, and that's been true Renaissance ever since. When I put words on a screen like this and they dance around, as has been observed often since then, that whole sense of cultural authority is undermined and evaporates. You can't trust the words anymore because other people screw around with them, they dance around. The whole idea of revision undermines the fundamental premise of Renaissance humanism. When I realized that, I've thought, oh dear, I've hoisted myself on my own petard. So I haven't talked about it much, but it's very interesting, isn't it? Another thing is interesting. There's a great book I would recommend to you. It hasn't come to much notice ever. It's an old book by Michael Baxendale called Giotto and the Orators. And he argues that the real center of early Renaissance humanism, Latin humanism in Italy, but English humanism too, was the periodic sentence. And the periodic sentence emphasizes a hierarchical structure. And what's happening, or what I'm talking about here in this film, was hierarchy decayed, hierarchy getting loose. And you certainly see this much more now in, for example, the syntax on blogs, which I hasten to say I don't read nearly so often as I'm sure all the rest of you do. So you return once again to the structure of the single sentence as fundamental to all kinds of issues. What I want to ask you about, and then I'll shut up and ask you all. Yep.
Can we ask that during our discussion section? Can we move the asking to the discussion?
Sure. Can I just say one little teeny thing more? I always run over. I was the laughing stock of my students. I would always, before each lecture, I would give an outline of 5 points, and they would say, well, he got to 3.5 today, not too bad. What I've been interested in from the beginning, I've been interested in rhetorical figuration and written a lot about Greek and Latin figures of speech. What happened in Greece, I think, this is guesswork, when the alphabet slowly over several hundred years took over, is that they tried to embody in alphabetic notation the gestural communication so fundamental to an oral culture. And that meant that they tried to create or embed spatial information in notation, in alphabetic notation. And I think there is hidden in alphabetic notation a great deal of of spatial information, two-dimensional information I'm sure of. That's a series of figures called the figures of arrangement. But I also think that somehow there's three-dimensional information there, and I can't help thinking that that ought to be, I ought to be able to extract that. Maybe you guys can help me with it. You know, we're always talking about getting to the bottom of an argument, seeing behind something. Our discussion of this is of words very often uses spatial metaphors. I used one example on that website I asked you all to look at by a program called PAD, made at NYU. Anyway, those are some of the things that interest me, and so now I'll stop. Thank you. Thank you.
Oh, over there's fine. As we did yesterday, we'll have a short break just to stretch a little bit as we switch over, and I'll introduce John in a moment as we get the technology rolling.